Randomizor is a twin-stick shooter demo that I put together in order to familiarize myself with the Unity engine. As this was primarily an exercise in learning the tool, I wanted to keep the design fairly simple. I looked to two successful indie titles that I love for inspiration: The Binding of Isaac, a procedurally generated roguelike top-down shooter, and Slay the Spire, a roguelike sequential deck builder. The core loop of the game is a combat-focused, Legend of Zelda-style room-to-room progression, where the player must defeat all of the enemies in each room in order to progress to the next. Each floor also contains a treasure room with a selection of 3 random power-ups the player must choose from in order to progress. The deck-building element is that rather than every item granting a stacking buff to the player, each time the player enters a room they equip 3 random items from the deck, an array containing the starting pistol and all of the items they've collected so far in their run. By constantly adding new items to the deck and forcing the player to clear each room with a different loadout, I increase the variety of play experience as the game goes on, and also its replayability. This also forces players to adapt to situations that may be more difficult. Melee enemies may be easier to engage with long-range attacks, but the deck may not be cooperative this room and gives you a short-range attack in a room full of zombies. Or it may give you an area of effect weapon like the flamethrower against a single tough enemy instead of something that favors single-target high damage. On the flip side, if you draw exactly the right tools for a room, it feels great. The goal here is to specifically avoid the natural tendency for players to get locked in on collecting items that they already know and like over and over. Treasure comes in 2 forms: weapons and power-ups. Weapons have a hierarchy with more powerful weapons superseding the less powerful, so the most powerful one that you draw for a given room determines what kind of attack that you have. Whereas power-ups modify something about the attack, like the number of projectiles fired or the attack speed, things like that. Power-ups don't stack, making taking a broad selection of them desirable. The player needs to be looking not just for what is the most powerful combo that I can pick, but does the power I get from this outweigh the inconsistency it brings if I add it to my deck? When I first started playtesting the game, the pistol wasn't an item yet. It was just the default attack that you got if you didn't draw another weapon for a room. This led to a strategy of only picking up power-ups instead of new weapons, as having 3 power-ups was generally about as valuable as 2 power-ups and a better base weapon. But this made for a much less varied experience than I had intended. I addressed this by making the starting pistol the first item in the player's deck and having it be randomly selected along with everything else. Unfortunately, this meant that if the player picked up too many power-ups and no weapons, they could weight their deck such that when they entered a new room, they didn't draw any weapon, and so couldn't attack at all, rendering them unable to progress. Obviously, we couldn't have that, so I fixed it by giving the players a default melee attack that would be used when no weapon was drawn from the deck for a new room. This kept the joy of upgrading to new, more powerful weapons, and strongly reinforced the need to balance upgrades versus weapons. As the game goes on, I had wanted the player to need more and more powerful items to combat the more difficult monsters. This proved difficult to balance due to the random nature of the game. This necessitated keeping the difficulty curve fairly low to maintain some ability to progress, even in the face of a very poor draw from your deck, and made getting more powerful combos a lot less critical. If I was going to flesh this demo out into a full product, the first things that I would be looking at, after hiring an artist to replace all of the assets I don't have the rights to, of course, would be procedural generation for the levels and risk-reward elements. I'd like to allow the player to take a path with more monsters per room for a chance at a treasure room with a better selection of items, that kind of thing. This runs double duty in giving the player opt-in difficulty settings and rewarding a player who gets a strong set of gear with more interesting fights. After those fairly low-hanging fruit, the real meat of the project would be to build an extensive list of treasures and give them all synergy effects with other items in the pool. Mechanical discovery is one of my favorite elements of fun in any game, and giving the player a huge list of possible combo effects would make for surprising power spikes long into the game's life cycle due to the double random nature of the deck system. It also helps maintain the challenge of the game while retaining the joy of finding powerful combinations, because being super powerful for one room instead of for the entire rest of the run keeps the player chasing that high because it never has the opportunity to become stale. When I was working with Big Fish Games, Jason Mai talked extensively about what he calls juice. This is the flashy elements that provide feedback on actions in the game, like screen shake, weapon flash, characters deforming for accelerating and decelerating, and also big splashy victory screens for completing a level, defeating a boss, or getting a particularly good combo in a puzzle game, like the full 5-line clear in Tetris. I did implement a little bit of juice in the blood splashes when an enemy takes damage, and the knockback when the player takes a hit, but there's a ton of work left to polish this up to a full releasable title. Sebastien Benard of Deep Night Games has an absolutely fantastic demonstration of this concept that he calls Game Feel that I've linked in the description. This exercise really drove home how much production time can be saved by working with my engineers early in the project to identify easy versus difficult implementation tasks, define how our logical structures need to be laid out, and what variables need to be soft-coded and exposed. Obviously, things change a lot during development, but everyone being on the same page early makes it much easier to achieve the game's desired balance and feel.